Thank you, Vincent, for joining us today and for interviewing with me about your paper. So I'm speaking with Vincent Goossaert, who is affiliated with the religious science section of the École pratique des hautes études, or the EPHE. And so we're speaking today about his paper, Alcohol and the Religious Regulation of Bodies in Late Imperial China. It's a fascinating paper, Vincent, and thank you so much for the opportunity to read it. I was very, very interested in its contents. So I just thought I'd start with the first question really to you is, what is the central question that you try and address with this particular paper?
Thank you, Mukta. It's a pleasure for me too. I was really looking forward to flying to Atlanta because I've never been there. This is not going to happen this time, but hopefully before too long.
Hopefully.
But I'm still happy. I can talk with you and through our conversation, reach out to the other participants of this great conference. Okay, what I do normally is not the history of food or food culture per se. I'm historian of Chinese religions, but I look at texts that really deal with all aspects of human life and social life. And that, of course, includes bodily behaviors, including eating, drinking, sleeping, having sex, relating to others, love, hate, passion, whatever. And so I think that's what the kind of texts I read are relevant to food culture, and that's what I was trying to address in this paper through the particular question of alcohol. But as I've tried to show, whether we talk about narratives or prescriptive texts produced by religious groups in early modern and modern China, food in general and meat in particular, alcohol and sex are three aspects of bodily behaviors that are really linked to each other in all sort of ways. So through the lens of alcohol, I was trying to look at religious regulations of all of those things. Right. And my research question is how to, through the perspective of religious text, that is leaders, thinkers, experts, trying to prescribe what ordinary people should do with their bodies, how can we, through the lens of this text, can we reconcile the two different views that we have of late imperial culture and late imperial elite culture in particular, one that tends to emphasize hedonism, right? So these people are really, in the writings of many scholars, these are people for whom religion is not something important and for whom life is about, enjoying oneself, right? So banquets, good food, drinking parties,
good companionship,
and a companionship, and of course the brothels and all of those things, and courtesans and whatnot. So that's one view, and another view is by scholars of law or politics who have talked about the Puritan turn in late imperial times. Mostly people working on sexuality, but not only that. We've talked about a late imperial society that is supposedly very Confucian. I don't think that's a good way to put it, but anyway, that really try to restrain all kinds of bodily pleasures, criminalizing all sort of behaviors, right? Especially sexuality, but not only sexuality. And I think alcohol was an interesting window into these questions, right? So are these people really basically enjoying lives to the full with little restraint, or are they living in a Puritan society where over enjoyment of any kind of bodily pleasure is to be frowned upon, is criticized? And the kind of text I've been reading and discussing in my paper, I think show that there were both tendencies at work, and that people are trying to negotiate between the two.
Before we delve into your, your kind of preliminary and very interesting findings about this negotiation, the text, can we expand a little bit about the texts that you ended up using and you cite within the paper yourself? So you use various sets of texts, right? You have these sound fascinating, these morality books coming out of a tradition of sort of sort of kind of kind of this kind of puritanism, I suppose, but also balancing all sorts of this negotiation. You've got you sort of direct instructions from God via these via spirit writings, via the altar. Then you've got this fascinating ledgers of merits and demerits and other sources. How did you bring this corpus of material together, and how did you end up using them to be able to create this complex picture?
This is an absolutely massive literature, and the amount of sources that are available is growing by the day, because for a long time scholars both within China and outside China tending to think of that as popular, repetitive, and interesting.
Hmm.
And actually, it might be popular in the sense of widely shared, but these texts were produced by elites and in some kinds very high-ranking officials. So they were inclusive rather than exclusive in terms
Mhm.
of social class. They might be repetitive, but I find them very interesting because they really deal with actual issues and problems. There are lots of stories and anecdotes about real people, and in many cases, people we know from the more standard sort of
Stories.
historical sources. They are extremely rich in detail, and they discuss. I mean, they might. I mean, from a theoretical perspective, I mean, this is not really top-notch theology, right? The theoretical thinking is most of the time, some texts might be very innovative and interesting, but most of the time they are very practical. So they really deal about real issues. So I think this is great material, not only for religious history, but for all kinds of fields. I mean, economic history, cultural history, social history, family history, and food history, because we have really
Mm.
thousands of pages talking about how you should, what you should eat, but also how you should eat, with whom you should eat, and that kind of things. And the dialogues with the gods through spirit writing answer very precise, practical questions by the people who are taking part in that kind of spirit writing groups, right? So it's not only really top down,
Mm.
very
Just
general advice about the good life, but it's records of discussions about specific issues encountered by specific people in specific circumstances. So this is really great material. Now, how to put it together and how to use it, that's another question. We are right now with colleagues in Europe and North America and China, Taiwan, other places, building an open access databases of all of
mm.
these texts. It's called CRTA, Chinese Religious Text Authority. You can go
Mhm.
online, find it at crta.info. We are trying to make a map of this literature to make it available for historians, and including people who do like food history, theater history, economic history, whatever, people who are not used to read religious texts, but who would have benefit from reading these texts because they talk about this
Mm.
practical social problems. So it's so huge. Many texts were just made available through reprint collections over the last few years. So basically, right now we are skimming the cream
The
of
top of
this
it.
huge milk ocean.
Wow.
That's what it is. But just skimming the surface, it already provides rich material inside. But there is so much more to be done.
It's brilliant. It's so, and you can I mean, your paper, you talk about it as a preliminary paper, but really it already provides such a rich picture of this idea of not necessarily abstinence and not necessarily hedonism, but somewhere in between, this kind of self-control. This the you talk about this idea that actually elites, these kind of scholar gentry people, were all about finding and developing a sort of a disciplinary mechanism for themselves, right, around
Yeah,
alcohol as well
yeah.
as meat and sex. Would you be able to expand on that and maybe talk about the most interesting finding that you encountered in the course of formulating this particular paper?
Well, there's this really tantalizing stories of people who decide to do more than the average person and really go into a permanent vegetarian diet, and abstain from sex after they have begotten a son, of course, because that's a duty. And so really do more in terms of bodily self-discipline than the average person, but we still enjoy their drinks, right? uh, and there's negotiation around that, and their friends trying to tell them that, okay, they are, very good people, but they have not taken the last step, so maybe you should do that too. And actually it resonates with things I've heard in the field when doing field works today, in religious groups, where leaders tell me, we try to convince people to be completely, teetotal and vegetarian and sex abstinent, but we know that all of that is very difficult. So if they have a drink with their friends once in a while, maybe that's something we can, live with, right? So alcohol seems, not in all cases, but alcohol seems in many cases to be the last thing that
Mm.
people cling to have a bit of,
Mm.
um, uh,
To be socially
of
connected, to be, yeah.
yeah, of social pleasure, that is something they can share with, their friends and kin who have not gone so far as they have in terms of, developing a complete self-control over their bodies.
Mm. I found it fascinating, and you touched upon this briefly as well in your paper, that you didn't find any instances of a prescribed approach to sort of balancing these situations and balancing
Mm,
your kind of alcoholic diet, right?
mm,
It felt like these scholarly gentry, it was a kind of learned behavior to stay within a certain bandwidth of alcohol consumption. This was something you couldn't write or describe in words, but you had to kind of learn it in a bodily way, rather than transmit knowledge through these texts. I found that really
mm.
fascinating. Is that something that you might, that as you end up delving deeper into this corpus, that there might be some instances where
That's
becomes clearer, or
yeah, yeah. Thank you. That's something I'm really hoping to find. And this literature is so vast. I mean, the late imperial Chinese elites were producing texts in such massive amounts that I think everything is there. You just have to find it. Um, but my intuition is that there was definitely a learning process. And if I might, say something from a more personal angle, it's very common because I'm come from this Flemish Catholic family background, and that's a background where you learn to drink. It's a social process, and during large family events, even the teenagers, they drink together, and the adults are there. They pretend they are not watching. They are keeping an eye. They let the young do their things, but and no one wants to get drunk and be ridiculous, right?
mm,
And so everybody's watching everybody, and everybody's testing his or her own limits. So it's definitely a social learning process, how to drink, how to get the pleasure out of it, but not going too far,
mm,
and maintaining control, right?
mm,
And I think that's a universal thing. Maybe it's stronger in Catholic culture than in Northern European Protestant culture. That's something I've heard a lot. It's not my opinion. It's I
mm,
think I'm not sure it's true, but it's a widely held opinion that there's a very different drinking culture.
mm,
Well, when in Catholic families, when those I know, um, learning how to drink is part of a much larger education, and it's something that should be done, because knowing how to drink and knowing your limits is a skill that you will need in
mm,
your social life,
mm,
right? And I think something of that kind was at work among the late imperial Chinese, and if that's the case, then it would be interesting to see whether that sort of drinking culture has been transmitted today, or if the contemporary Chinese drinking culture is something entirely new, right?
Mm.
Where
Mm.
binge drinking is more acceptable or more part of the
Social
landscape.
fabric. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So,
But for my, if I just may
mm,
add one sentence, I think for my late imperial Chinese guys, to be a skilled drinker, knowing how to drink was as much respected, if not even more respected, than being a teetotal, because it
interesting.
showed an even higher degree of self-discipline and self-knowledge and self-control.
Fantastic. Vincent, just maybe telescoping out a little bit and looking at the broader discipline area, really. Your paper sort of carves out an area of time between the 1700s to the 1900s.
Mm.
You're basically sort of encompassing the apogee of Qing political culture, and then it's slow. I guess it's decline in the latter century. How does this kind of history of this particular of the gentry, the scholar gentries and their drinking, how does it sort of sit within a broader look at these couple of centuries? And where do you think your paper maybe sits or resonates with other scholarship in the field?
I think this kind of cultural religious history is partly, I mean, it develops at a different pace than political history, and of course the two must be put in some sort of dialogue. But the practice of being mentored by the gods, reading this religious literature, um, living by the morality books, and so on and so forth, is very continuous. It's something that really develops strongly. It has much earlier antecedents, of course, but it really develops very strongly in the late Ming, in a 16th century, and then it continuously develops into the 20th century, and it's still present in many ways in 21st century China. Um, and during the 19th century, when through all the political crisis and the civil wars and so on and so forth, this religious culture is a resource that elites draw on to face the crisis of that time.
Mm.
Right, during the Taiping War,
Mm.
there is a massive productions of those spirit-written revelations and morality books, because that's one way. Then it's a toolbox
Mm.
for resilience, right? It's a set of discourse and ideas and practices that the elites can draw on to
Mm.
survive, to make
Mm.
sense of the events, of what is happening, and to survive. Right? And it's
Mm.
certainly the case that it was very common during all the crises of the 19th century, and especially the Taiping War, which was a disaster on its on just unthinkable scale for these people
Mm.
who just literally saw their world collide and,
Collapse,
and,
yeah.
and collapse entirely.
Mm.
Um, and they practice spirit writing and publish morality books in huge amount, right? You would think that in the middle of a war they would have more pressing things to do than
Sit
uh,
down and write.
sit down and write and ask questions to the god and print the
Mm.
results, but that's what they did. um, and one of the ways they explained the war was that humanity has just been indulging in
Mm.
sin in general, and especially in immoral sex and
Mm.
in killing animals for buttering,
Mm.
to an extent that I just decided the gods to just put an end to it
Mm.
and to call for the final apocalypse. Right? So there were major calls for say, if you want this war to stop, this massacre to stop, stop having sex, stop eating meat. And
Wow.
that's not an isolated case of some crackpot somewhere who said that. It's a discourse you find all over China during the war.
it certainly strikes
Mm.
you as very Victorian as well, and so you
Yeah.
find that
Mm.
Britain also embraces something like that with its wars in the late 19th century. So it does feel like it's something that it's a discourse that does have resonances in other places too.
Yeah, I think
Sorry.
the parallel with Puritanism is definitely
Mm,
an interesting thing to play with when we look at
mm.
China. That's for sure.
That's brilliant. Well, Vincent, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk about this. This is fantastic.